Welcome to the Teaching Mythology podcast. I'm your host, Leslie, from Education is Powerful. Come with me as we explore myths through a modern-day lens. Hello! It is currently early December, and I thought I would do something a little different for the Christmas season and share Christmas-related stories from around the world, and talk about any gods or goddesses that are related to Christmas or winter or the winter solstice. So I just want to have a little disclaimer here. I'm going to be telling a lot of folk tales and folk stories, and I'm not as familiar with them as I am the myths. So I've written out a little script. I have no idea how to say any of the names, so please give me a little grace this time. First, we're going to talk about Greek mythology. Now, there's a goddess whose name is Chione. She is the daughter of Boreas, who is the god of the north wind. And he was married to a princess from Athens. And so she is actually the daughter of Boreas, the god of the north wind, and this princess from Athens. And she is actually raised on earth, right? Like every sort of half god is. Now, once she becomes an adult, she is loved by Poseidon. And it doesn't really say whether or not she loved him back. But as we've learned, whenever gods love humans, of course they get them. And there's always a child. So after her love affair with Poseidon, she bears a child. And this child's name is Eumolpus. Now, there are a few other stories about Chione, but in her life, she was said to have been raped by Hermes, and Apollo fell in love with her. After she was raped by Hermes, Apollo appeared to her as an old woman and comforted her, and she fell in love with him. So later on in her life, she boasted that she was actually better than the goddess Artemis because two gods fell in love with her and nobody fell in love with Artemis. And according to the myths, Artemis sought revenge. And so Artemis ended up killing Chione's son, Epomus. So it's not really a Christmas story, but she is the goddess of snow. And it makes sense. In the Greek world, they didn't really have snow. It had to have been such a small, minor occurrence that she didn't warrant very much in their world. Moving on to Norse mythology. In Norse mythology, they have a goddess named Skadi, and she is one of the most famous goddesses mentioned in the prose and poetic Epica. And according to the Norse myths, Skadi was actually a Jotun, which remember is the race of giants who live in Jotunheim, and Loki is a Jotun giant. So she's a giant, and she is associated with winter, snow, skiing, and hunting. But she's also the goddess of cold and darkness, and her home is in the mountains, where the snow never melts. It is said that she hunts with a bow and is known to be seen in the mountains wearing snowshoes or skis. Now, her tale in Norse mythology starts with the giant Thiazi. And Thiazi was actually killed by the Aesir gods as they were pursuing Loki to punish him for one of the things he's ever done. When Skadi's father, Thiazi, was killed, she sought vengeance against the Aesir gods. So she goes to Odin's hall and she demands restitution. So for restitution, they tell her that they will take her father's eyes and place them in the night sky as stars, and that she could choose any of their kind to marry. But there was a condition. She could only look at their feet and legs in the choosing. Now, Skadi was in love with Balder, who is the god of light in the Norse myth. So this is really interesting, this dichotomy that the goddess of darkness is in love with the god of light. So opposites attract, right? And she thought she would be able to tell his feet from all of the others. Turns out it wasn't the case. And she ended up choosing the feet of the sea god Njord. And it was a binding thing. She couldn't get out of it just because she didn't choose the person she wanted. They decided to split their time between Skadi's home in the mountains and Njord's coastal abode near the sea. And in the end, Njord couldn't take the howling of the mountain wolves, and he said that the mountains were just so vast and huge. So they decided to go to Njord's house or home near the sea, and Skadi could not sleep with the screeching of the coastal gulls, and she felt like the ocean was too vast and empty. So they decided to live separately. They each returned to their own home, and they never had children. But Skadi shows up later in the torturing of Loki, and so she finally does get revenge for her father's death. The last official goddess I wanted to talk about was Strenua, who is actually a Roman goddess. Well, she's a Sabine goddess, which I don't get into this too much because I focus on Greek mythology. But the Sabine are older than the Roman gods, or when the Roman society was in its very early stages. It is said that the cult, or the people who worshipped her, one of the main members was King Titus Tatius, who actually ruled as a co-ruler over Rome with Romulus. So this is how old she is in Roman mythology. In the Roman myths, on New Year's Day, they would, not just in the myths, but in ancient Rome, on New Year's Day, they would take her image and branches of laurel and wreaths, and they would gather them together, and they would carry a shrine to her in a procession up to the Arcs on Capitoline Hill. And this was the highest point in Rome, and it was a huge open space where the augurs conducted their rituals, right? They're their seers, their prophets. They would conduct these rituals and determine whether or not the gods approved of whatever undertaking was at hand. And so it was a way of prophesying or seeing into what the next year would come. The belief was that in carrying this shrine of Strenua up the hill, it was a way for Romans to seek her benefits or her blessings for the upcoming year. Now, this ceremony grew as the years went on and became bigger than what it was initially, and it turned into passing gifts between family and friends on the first day of New Year. And these gifts were symbolic of prayers for good health and a good year. Interestingly enough, they would wrap these gifts with a twig of laurel and red yarn. And they would take this twig of laurel, which had to have 7 leaves, and then burn it as incense to the goddess Strenua. So I love this because it's very symbolic of what we do today. I mean, we still wrap gifts with red bows and some kind of plant as decoration for some people, even if it's fake, right? Now, a lot of people believe that Strenua is actually the origin story of Bafana, which is Italian folklore. So let's talk about Bafana next. Now, she is known sometimes as a witch, and she is associated with the Feast of Epiphany. So Epiphany happens on January 6th, and it is a feast that's celebrated in Europe that celebrates the moment when the 3 wise men just realized that Jesus was born, and they decided to go searching for the newborn babe. So legend has it that Bafana is a homemaker who is obsessed with having a clean house. So she is very often depicted as having a broom, which leads to a witch type figure. So she was an old lady who lived by herself, and the 3 wise men stopped by her home and asked for directions if she knew where they could find the baby Jesus. She doesn't know anything about this Jesus baby, but she decides to offer them a place to stay for the night. So they spend the night there, and in the morning, they offer her the opportunity to go with them to find this baby. She turns them down. And in the myth and in the folk tale, it said that she was concerned about having a clean house, and she wants to sweep up the house before she leaves. And she can't go with them, but she has a change of heart, and she decides that she's going to go with them. So she gathers up all of her presents and sets out to follow their tracks and meet up with them. But it's snowing, and the wind has blown their tracks over, so she has no idea where they've gone. And so instead of going with them, she goes from house to house, giving gifts or leaving gifts for all the children. And of course, this expanded into her leaving gifts for all of the children in Italy. Now, the broom has come to symbolize sweeping out the old year and allowing for the problems of last year to be swept away, and it's a new year. Sometimes in Italy, they would leave out a snack, wine over milk, or a plate of regional specialties, right? Like the banal cookie plate. And this is really great because it's a connection to Santa Claus and us leaving out milk and cookies for Santa Claus. Bafana wasn't the only figure that's like this in the European world. There are several in the Germanic region, and so we're going to kind of group all of them together. So we have Perchta, which is the Bavarian Christmas witch. In ancient Germanic tradition, she is a goddess in the pagan pantheon in the Alps on the German side. So she actually was considered the embodiment of fate and of the souls of the dead, and so you would often see her associated with weaving or string or yarn, just like the Greek fates were associated with those things. Now, sometimes Perchta would appear as an old crone, and sometimes she was a beautiful snow maiden. Sometimes she is described as being young, pale, beautiful, or an elderly hag with one large foot that they say is the size of a goose or a duck. She kind of really became popularized with the Grimm's fairy tales. And so she gets adopted into this Christmas lore, moved from the Germanic pagan system into this Christmas Christian system. But she is said to know who has been a good worker that year and who has not. And if you have been a good worker, then she will leave a silver coin in your shoe. And if you are not a good worker, she would slit open your belly, remove your intestines, and stuff you with pebbles and straw. Yuck. She has this really kind of good and sort of disastrous image, like a scary image, right? And this comes from the Middle Ages, where we're in the middle of a feudal system. And as a serf, you needed to work hard in order to survive. So the people would actually leave food out for her as a symbol of good fortune. Even today, sometimes they'll leave out a bowl of porridge for Perchta, and they will actually hold ringing bell processions during midwinter through Epiphany, or they'll have carnivals in honor of her. So people will even dress up as her and give candy and nuts to good children and then hit the naughty ones with a rod, all while ringing a cowbell on this procession. I wouldn't want to run into her, that's for sure. Now, if we go back down to Greece, post-ancient Greece, and we're into the Christian era of Greece, we have a man known as Bishop Nikolaus, and he actually ends up becoming a Christian saint. And so we probably know him as Saint Nikolaus or Saint Nick. And he appears in the 4th century. Now, He's known as Nikolaus the Wonder Worker because he was known for giving secret gifts to the people. And he would place coins in the shoes of those who were left out of Christmas or who didn't have gifts. So here we have a figure in ancient Greece leaving coins in shoes. And then in the Germanic area, we have Perchta leaving coins in shoes. And now we hang stockings and we fill our stockings with little treats. Now it's said that while he was bishop, he was very wealthy, which makes sense. The ancient Christian church is known for having religious figures buy their way into the priesthood. So this is not unusual. But when his parents died and the money really became his, he decided to follow Jesus' instructions to sell everything you own and give it to the poor. And remember, that's the story of the rich man who is trying to fit through, or is trying to make it to heaven. And Christ says it would be easier for a camel to fit through the eye of the needle, which was a gate in Jerusalem. And he says, what am I supposed to do? And Christ tells him, you need to give everything you own away and give it to the poor. And the rich man can't. And he leaves. St. Nikolaus does give everything away to the poor. And he's known for living that way for the rest of his life. So he's the patron saint of beggars, students, sailors, merchants, repentant thieves, and children. And one of the stories he's most known for is that he overheard a poor father complaining about the fact that he could not give his daughters a dowry, which meant that they could never be married, or they would have to prostitute themselves. So Nikolaus took it upon himself to secretly leave 3 purses full of gold coins in their house for these dowries, rather than humiliating the father with charity. All right, let's head up north to Wales. And this isn't so much a Christmas figure, but it is a story that explains why we go caroling, basically. It is said that between Christmas and New Year's, Welsh men would ride a dead horse around town and sing. Now, this dead horse was described as bones, and they would put glass eyes in its skull and put the head on a stick and then attach a gray cloak behind it to show it as a horse, to make it look like a horse. And they called it the Gray Mare. Now, I can't speak Welsh, and I'm not even going to try to say what this word is spelled. So we'll just say Gray Mare. And they called this singing around town their wassailing adventures. And of course, we have the Christmas song, Here We Go A-Wassailing, right? I'm going to call them the Gray Mare Party, or the Gray Mare Singers, and everyone else the partygoers. When the Gray Mare Singers would arrive at a house or a bar in which they wanted to drink, they would sing a song in order to enter. Now, the people inside are supposed to decline this request, and so the Gray Mare sing a second song. Then they are brought inside, and a competition of sorts begins, in which the Gray Mare party insults the partygoers in rhyme. And then they flip, and the partygoers insult the Gray Mare men, the singers, and they keep going back and forth until one group is bested and everyone is sufficiently drunk enough to move on to the next house and start their next serenade and insult slinging. It's kind of a funny tradition. But if you think about it, when we go caroling, we sing at houses, and then they're expected to give us food, cookies, treats, hot chocolate, wassail, and then we move on to the next house. While I haven't had a caroler at my house in several years, I think the tradition has kind of gone out of style. We still have carolers out in squares and malls, and instead of giving them cookies or wassail or alcohol, we give them coins. Next, we're going to talk about Olentzero, who is the Basque Santa Claus. Now, there are a lot of variations to this legend or this folktale, which makes sense. The Basque people between France and Spain are really isolated, but I can see that each one of the villages probably would have had their own spin on Olentzero. I'm going to tell 2 stories about him. One is that he belonged to a mythical race of people that were giants. And he lived peacefully on Earth until one day a cloud appeared in the sky, and it was only visible to one blind old man. And the blind man interpreted this to mean that Jesus was soon going to be born. And this old man knew that he needed to live with this new religion that he didn't understand, so he asked all the giants to throw themselves off a cliff. And the giants agreed, which is wild to me, but they agreed. And so they all tripped and fell over the cliff except for Olentzero. And as the sole survivor, he embraced Christianity and then swiftly turned into this merry gift giver he is today. And when we think about Santa Claus or St. Nikolaus or even the ghost of Christmas present in Dickens, they're usually described as being quite large men, either large in size, large in stature, maybe a little both. And I can't help but think that this is a callback to Olentzero. Another popular story about Olentzero is that he was actually abandoned as a newborn, and a fairy found him and gave him superpowers, and then had him adopted. He grew to be kind and gentle until one day he ended up dying, saving children from a burning building. And to honor him for this sacrifice, the fairy actually brought him back to life, and then he had the job of giving presents to children, which is totally a harken back to Santa Claus as well. Now let's come across the Atlantic into the North American continent. Let's talk about an indigenous people's mythology, or it's not really a mythology because they still practice this today. That also means it's not a folktale. It's a celebration that still occurs today every year. So this celebration is called the Soyal, and it is practiced by the Hopi people who live in the northern part of Arizona. And the Hopi have lived there for over 1,000 years. And this is one of their most important ceremonies that they perform. And it starts at the winter solstice and lasts 16 days in a kiva, which is an underground space that they would perform ceremonies in. And they perform this celebration because they believe that at the winter solstice, it is during this time that the Kachinas, who are the spirits who watch over the Hopi, come down from the mountains and bring the sun back into the world, which is a beautiful image because after the winter solstice, it gets lighter and lighter every day. This is also a time for them to perform purification rituals and to pray. And it is thought that this is like a rebirth for the new year, and everything that happens in the new year is arranged at the soil ceremonies. In these ceremonies, there's dancing, singing, giving gifts to children, and storytelling. And the stories would pass from the elders into future generations. Now, I haven't done any Native American mythology on the podcast, but many Native American peoples believe that the earth has had several stages or rebirths already. And so the Hopi, as they do this celebration, it symbolizes the second phase of creation at the dawn of life. And it sets forth the plan for the coming year. And part of the ceremonies are ways that they can teach their children about who they should be or how they want them to behave. So part of the storytelling is that they would teach these lessons like respecting others, working hard, those sorts of things. It's a really beautiful winter solstice ritual. And I hope you're starting to see that there are a lot of these beliefs, folktales, rituals, ceremonies that have a rebirth happening at the new year. That part of this season is a way to flesh out the old and welcome in the new. Now, the last two I'm going to tell are not happy stories. They're kind of scary. And I think that they're told as a way to keep children good and behaving. And we still do this today. I've heard many a parent say to their children, Santa's watching. You don't want to be naughty or else you won't get any presents from Santa Claus. Or now we have this tradition that I find quite strange, honestly, of the elf on the shelf, and that the elf is watching all of the children leading up to Christmas, and the elf does silly things and tricks and makes messes, which is crazy because if he's supposed to be watching the children to make sure that they're good, but he's doing all these bad things, I don't know. I don't get it, but I don't have children. It is what it is. So the first kind of scary winter figure I'm going to talk about is Gryla, and she comes from Scandinavia. And she is a giant or an ogress who lives up in the mountains. She's described as having many tails, hooves instead of feet, and she hungers for human flesh. And what she especially likes are naughty little children. In fact, she will come down the mountain every Christmas Eve to collect all of the naughty children to feed her throughout the year. So she's also the mother of the Yule lads, if you've heard of them. They are little mischievous trolls who play pranks on humans leading up to Christmas. And there's one Yule lad that shows up every day leading up to Christmas Day. Again, elf on the shelf, a little much. Anyway, the kind of third part of Gryla is that she has this Yule cat that she keeps, who is a giant, fearless, fearsome feline who stalks the countryside on Christmas Eve and devours all of those who don't receive new clothing to wear. Now, that seems to come out of nowhere, but if you remember Bafana knew who was a good worker. So it's harken back to Bafana in a way, where part of the Scandinavian ritual of this is that the seamstresses or the wives and sisters would have to work extra hard to make sure that everyone in their home had new clothes so that the Yule cat would not come and eat them. And the men and the boys, the farmers, would have to work extra hard to make sure that all of the work was done before the holidays came so that they could be inside and not out in the countryside and have their new clothes on. And really, this is just a way of combating laziness, just like Bafana knew who was a hard worker and who wasn't. It's a way of controlling societal behavior. The Yule cat also encourages gifting to not just to your friends and loved ones, but to those who are less fortunate. So they would make clothes for everyone and made sure that everyone had enough clothes. The last sort of scary story that you've probably heard of if you've seen a movie is Krampus. Now, I haven't seen this movie, so I don't know how accurate it is, but Krampus comes from the Austro-Bavarian area of Eastern Europe. And it is said that the day before the feast of St. Nicholas, which is December 6th, is actually the night that Krampus comes, so on December 5th. Now it comes from around 1600s, and Krampus is a companion to Santa Claus. Now, Santa Claus is there to give gifts to all the good children, and Krampus is there to punish children who have been bad. And he is described as having devilish horns. He's excessively violent, and he actually became a really popular figure. Even to this day, when they have Christmas parades, there's always a Krampus figure. People dress up as Krampus. Children get their pictures with Krampus. I guess he's not as scary now as he used to be. Krampus would actually, on December 5th, go from house to house, hunting down naughty children and throwing them in a sack, and so that he could take them down into the underworld. But not all is lost, because Krampus himself has a weakness, and he has a weakness for schnapps. So, if you offer him schnapps, he will pass by your house and he won't take your naughty children, so you can keep them for one more year. And he'll give you a lump of coal instead. And so here's where we get this lump of coal for those who are naughty, and for those who are good, they get candy and treats and gifts. So I hope you enjoy those stories. I hope I did them justice. And of course, there's, just like mythology, there are many different versions of these stories, and these folktale figures have been fictionalized. And so you can find children's books full of these stories that will probably be just a little bit different. I think what's really important today is that when we think of this winter season or this holiday season or this Christmas season, our traditions come from these ancient stories and from storytelling and passing down these traditions from generation to generation. And that's exactly what mythology is as well. The passing of stories or myths from generation to generation. And I think it really grounds us in traditions. And we still have many of these traditions today, even if it's in a minuscule form or changed. We still leave our socks out. We still say good children get gifts and naughty children get coal, although we never actually give a kid a piece of coal. We still leave food out for Santa, whether it's schnapps or porridge or little cookies. We still do all of those things. And I think it's cool when we see stories passing down from generation to generation like this over thousands of years. So I hope you have a very happy holiday season and that you get to have time to spend with your family and friends and refresh and rest yourself for the new year. Thanks for joining me today on Teaching Mythology. Don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.